Hello, this video then is all about contemporary urban environments. Just as a warning before we start, I'm not going to do case studies in this video, otherwise the video would be absolutely mammoth. I'm just going to go through the key areas for the topic. I reckon there are about 15 sort of key points, and if you're able to understand all of those, then you should be absolutely fine. So if we take contemporary urban to its simplest point, it revolves around this process of urbanisation. So where we've got an increase in the number of people living in our towns and cities. And that could be due to things like rural to urban migration being greater than those people that are moving away from the city, life expectancy increasing, natural population increase. All of those things are going to keep the number of people we've got in our urban areas nice and high. So the big problem with urbanisation is that it massively affects the developing world. Okay, and there are positives and negatives to that, of course. But what we might start to say is, well, if the developing world can't cope with all of these people now that are moving into urban areas, well, in turn, we might see issues with things like healthcare, education, power supplies, transport, waste management, all of those really key areas anyway in contemporary urban, and we'll go back and look at them. So what we're trying to sort of say here really is that urbanisation is the main focal point that really drives all of the issues then that we're going to go and look at. Now, the exam board, AQA, remember I've got this funny thing where they like us to look at this between 1945 and 2015. Okay, so they're trying to say to us, well, what's happening? So we know straight out of the gate, well, urbanisation has increased from 1945 to 2015. Okay, so the proportion of the global population then has increased from 1/3 to 1/2. Okay, so by 2050, it's expected that 2/3 of the global population is going to be living in an urban area. We know the number of people who live in urban areas has increased from about 0.7 billion to 4 billion during this time period as well. Looking at our map here as well, this is going to help us. So we can say, well, North America and Latin America are the most urbanised regions. Europe is expected to be more than 80% urban by 2050. Africa and Asia are going to remain mostly rural. But again, they are going to start to experience some rapid urbanisation too. Okay, so just being aware of the trend, so researching as part of your revision and having a little look at maps like these really helps you to back up with some facts and figures in your 20 markers. But in short, for urbanisation, you need to know what it is, what issues it could cause, what's happening worldwide. So if you need to pause here and do that, please do. So if we thought about urbanisation, let's think a bit more then about these urban processes. So there are sort of 3 key urban processes, which if you get your head around, you'll be absolutely fine. So if we have deindustrialisation, okay, this is when we get an absolute decline in the importance of manufacturing in the economy of a country. So in turn, there might be a fall in its contribution to GDP. Okay, so in some countries, if they're overly reliant on sort of traditional heavy industries, so for example, if they're reliant on iron or steel, it can lead them then to lose all of that investment. Okay, if we have strong overseas competition, again, the prices maybe in that country then are too high. Well, we're not going to need that anymore. We're going to move that manufacturing, aren't we, to where it's cheaper in order to maximise profits. So that in turn could cause us to get deindustrialisation. So I suppose sort of key points here then, we can put fall in contribution to GDP. So something I would definitely be talking about in the exam. And I would also talk about outsourcing overseas. So it's that increased competition here that's sort of driving that deindustrialisation. So we have decentralisation. Well, this is going to occur when there's an outward movement of population and industry. So there might be people moving from central urban areas to the suburbs and then to smaller areas. So we can sum this up here then. So if we put central goes to the suburbs, and this is going to go to smaller urban areas. So almost taking your traditional diagram of an urban area, so things like the Burgess model, and saying, well, if I work my way from the centre out, there's decentralisation. This idea then of the service economy is saying, well, if we have both deindustrialisation and decentralisation, well, that's going to cause us to get this service economy. Okay, if we have a service economy, it means there's been an increase in employment in education, healthcare, retailing. Okay, so we mostly see this in our sort of developed countries. So let's put this down here. Okay, so again, 3 key terms. If you're familiar with those, there's no reason why you can't do really well. So let's fast forward then to suburbanisation. So obviously you would use a case study here in the exam. We're not doing that, remember, we're just doing the key facts to start with. So we've got sort of 3 key areas for suburbanisation. So I've broken this down and said, well, first of all, we want to know about characteristics. Second of all, we want to know about the causes. And last but not least, then we want to know about the effects. Okay, so if we start with the characteristics, so what does this look like? Well, the picture here sort of helps us out with this a little bit, doesn't it? So we can say, well, we've got extensive areas of housing that are built on the edge of major cities. We might say, well, more recently, there's been development of new housing areas on this use of brownfield sites. So brownfield sites, remember, are areas of land that have been previously developed. Then we can go a bit further and say, well, that's led us to get some large private gardens, some open spaces. So really, now what we're starting to do is invest a little bit in green space and this idea of community. So what causes us then to get suburbanisation? Well, we might say things like if more people have cars, so car ownership, well, they can access these suburbs. Public transport, another facilitator here. We might say things like the presence of railway lines, arterial roads. But most importantly, to do this, it's quite an expensive move. Okay, so I would say wealth. Okay, wealth has to go up in order to facilitate this. So what sort of effects then is this going to have on areas like the one we can see in the picture? Well, first of all, we talked a lot about green space. So now we have this idea of green belt land. So that's that area of previously undeveloped land that surrounds any sort of town or city. We're going to get outward growth then of our development. So it might start to engulf nearby villages and rural areas. So that's urban sprawl, isn't it? And last but not least then, we might say, well, on the urban edge where land is available, we might start to see things like lots of car parking, a favoured sort of location for shopping and retail. So the second sort of big effect I might say here is out of town shopping. So you think like big retail parks on the outskirts of Reading, that would be an example here. Right then, counter-urbanisation. Let's keep going, shall we? So first of all with this one, I think we want to think, well, what causes this? What sort of effects have we got here? So counter-urbanisation is the movement of people from our larger urban areas into our smaller urban areas or rural areas, basically leapfrogging the rural-urban fringe. Okay, so what sort of things cause this? Well, the rising demand for second homes. Internet facilitates this, the idea that people can work from home. So let's put that one down. We might say, well, if people are a bit more affluent and have got higher car ownership, so again, wealth, money is always a facilitator. We might say, well, the need for rural areas to sort of attract income. So sometimes farmers raise money by selling unwanted land or buildings, so it sort of facilitates these developments anyway. And sometimes people just want to escape the city. People have had enough of them. They say, right, we can get a better quality of life if we move to these rural areas. The air typically is cleaner, there's less pollution, lower crime rate. Okay, of course, not all of these things are true by the time they get there. However, they have that perception, don't they? In order to have a perception that's sometimes influenced by things like the media, etc. And we'll talk about that anyway in Changing Places. But if people have got this idea that they're going to get this better quality of life and these things are going to be amazing, they're going to move. Okay, so this is going to result in some effects for us. Well, we might start to see the rise of things like commuter railway stations, so large areas for car parking. The big one, however, is rising house prices. So let's put that one down. If these areas are in demand and people have got wealth and everybody wants to be there, then of course the price of the house is going to go up. The growth of housing estates. Can't spell today. Let's change that one in a minute. So if we've got more and more people wanting to be there, more and more farmers selling the land, then in theory we should see more. We might say, well, this creates a real problem, doesn't it, for those people that were there in the first place. So if we say, right, these original residents now that really love the area, first time buyers, they want to go out and buy a house, well, it drives the price in that area up. So therefore people are priced out of the area that they've originally lived in. Okay, so it creates a real sort of divide almost between those people that have moved in and those people that have been there all along. Right then, next up is urban resurgence. Okay, so a bit like we've done before, follow the same pattern. So I think cause and effect. So I would sort of say, well, there are three main causes here for urban resurgence. So if we're talking about urban resurgence, we're saying, well, this is the movement of people back into urban areas, particularly in the inner city. So how are we going to get people back into those areas? Well, the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to regenerate. So if we regenerate the area, we might invest some money into it. We might say, right, here's some amazing ideas. Here's how we can make this better so we can boost the economy a little bit. Here's what we can do to improve sort of social and also environmental conditions of people as well. The next thing we might do is we might rebrand the area. So we might say, right, if we've regenerated the city's economy, we've changed the way it looks a little bit, we've given this a new positive image, we've completely almost given the area a facelift. The last thing we can do then is our gentrification. Perhaps the most famous example of this one's Notting Hill. So we might improve the houses. We might say, right, this is more done by people than it is by organisations. So things like giving your house a lick of paint, putting some nice flowers out, again, attracts people back into that. Okay, we'll talk more about sort of what that looks like in just a second. So if we think about what effects can we get from doing these three things as part of urban resurgence? Well, we might say give sort of a reuse or another purpose to buildings. This idea of the multiplier effect, I'll write that one down, quite a nice keyword you might choose to use in the exam. So the multiplier effect is the idea if you have one positive thing and then becomes 2, 3, 4 further down the line. Okay, so it booms in terms of growth. We might get what we sometimes call as well the 24-hour city. Okay, if you've got really vibrant city life, it's not just going to be a sort of 9 till 5 thing, is it? Okay, you might have vibrant nightlife, good sort of shopping links, community centres, etc. But all of that's going to keep your city ticking over 24 hours, which is where the term comes from. The big problem with doing this, however, is if you're sort of attracting loads of wealthy people back in, people now want to be there, prices in the area are starting to go up, quality of services, as you'd expect, would start to improve. The one sort of negative here is we might see displacement of lower income people. Okay, so we could start to see some inequality. If we've got those residents that were there before, they're now going to be outpriced from the area. So therefore it's going to lead us potentially to having some inequality. Okay, so that leads us quite nicely onto them talking about urban policy. And I've put the dates on here to make this nice and clear for you. But this is one thing I would try and sort of commit to memory as part of your revision. And of course, we've done a case study for each one of these. I'll very sort of briefly talk over what each one of these 4 is and sort of does and involves, so you can keep going. If you need to pause during this bit, please do. Right, let's start at the top then, shall we? So let's start with UDCs. So by UDC, I mean Urban Development Corporation. So we mostly had these in the UK between 1979 and the 1990s. So these sort of came about because we said, well, in 1979, many of our sort of UK city centres are in decline. So the government sort of developed these UDCs then, which used private sector funding to restore these derelict areas. So big examples of this then would be places like London Docklands. So if we take London Docklands, for example, The whole point in there of having this UDC was to bring in new businesses, improve the local environment, give new jobs, houses, etc., and really sort of pump investment back into that area. Okay, so we've done this throughout the country, it's not just London Docklands. So by about 1993, we've had about 12 of these successful regeneration campaigns, if you like, or UDCs. We'll talk more about this if you sort of look at notes on London Docklands. There are huge positives and negatives to them, and of course you'd weigh them up in the exam. But to start with, that's UDCs. Next, to sort of follow on from these and sort of overlaps a little bit, is our enterprise zones. Okay, so by 1981 we had enterprise zones established. Mostly these were used in areas that had high unemployment, so their aim was just to attract these companies to come back in, create jobs. There would be special benefits like reducing tax in order to attract these companies. So by about 1990, we had about 5,000 companies employing 125,000 people. Okay. The problem with these is it just sort of encouraged companies that are already really well established in an area to move in order to get those benefits like the tax reduction. City Challenge partnerships, one of my favourites. So those were between 1991 and 97. So these are local authorities that would compete for the government funding in order to regenerate one or two deprived areas within their sort of remit or region. So the whole point of these is we're saying, right, here's the local community, here's this private company, let's get them to work side by side in order to improve the environment in the area. So funding was then allocated to sort of the campaigns or the projects that the government thought were going to do sort of the best or the most good. So by about 1997, because of these, we got about 50,000 jobs, 40,000 houses improved. The big problem is because they were sort of cherry picking the ones that they thought were the best, well, many areas didn't actually get any funding at all. So therefore, in terms of success, we might say that sort of hampered it a little bit. It's relatively small scale. Partnership schemes then, from 2010, and we're still seeing these right up to the present day, is when the government's worked with a private company then to provide financial support and expertise in order to regenerate, hence the idea of partnership scheme. So the whole point of them is to just improve the physical, economic and social conditions within a deprived area. Okay, so loads of famous examples of them. We've done one, but again, you just want to say, right, here's what it was like before, here's what it's like now. Has this partnership scheme been successful? Why or why not? And that would apply to any of the four here. Okay, sort of a whistle-stop tour on urban policy. So if we think about urban form then, you've done a lot of research on this previously. Okay, but if we think, right, what is urban form to start with? Well, this is the arrangement of land use within the urban area. Okay, so what we're trying to say here is, well, how does urban form and the arrangement of land use sort of vary between the developed world and the developing world? Okay, so I think that's really important. So if we start then by thinking first of all about the developed world, let's highlight these and make them nice and clear. We might pick out a few key points. So sort of the first key point I'd pick out about urban form in the developed world is I might say, well, physical factors are important in sort of historical times. So towns were built alongside rivers, sort of the layout was almost well thought out. Okay, so you might say, well, first of all, sort of leads us to have mostly planned developments, doesn't it? Next, I might say, well, as time progressed, economic factors involving land values have become more important. Okay, so I might say, well, here, things like PLVI, really important. So that's your peak land value intersection. So you might find it useful to go back and revisit that diagram. So because we've got the PLVI becoming the economic core of the urban area, well, we're starting to see other uses of the city sort of spring up around this. So things like the CBD occurring was determined by the price of the land. And we know the further away we move from the CBD right out into our suburbs, well, the price of land should decrease. Okay, so that's our bid rent theory, in case you've forgotten. Let me jot that one down for you for your notes. So in recent decades then, suburban office and shopping areas have sort of resulted in these secondary land value peaks. Okay, so we're not just saying, well, the most expensive area must be right in the centre of the city, because now we're starting to get these pockets springing up on the outskirts because of processes like suburbanisation that are again now starting to drive that land value up. So if we compare this then to what it's like in the developing world, well, we might say cities are built up around sort of this central core, so it typically tends to follow that traditional diagram maybe. We might say, well, because of this, we're starting to get separate industrial sectors or developments on the edge of the city. So here we go, let's put this one down. So because of this, we're getting some gentrification to try and protect some of these historical quarters. We might get things like informal settlements starting to develop. Let's put that one in. And that, of course, is not saying, well, we don't get informal settlements in the developed world, because that would be completely and utterly untrue. Okay, but there's just sort of some of the characteristics or differences then between the two. Right then, let's think economic and social issues that might result from things such as urban form or urbanisation. So again, this is sort of a nice sort of area to link in all your knowledge now and start showing links across the topic and or others that you've studied as well. So if we think first of all then about economic inequality, well, it exists, doesn't it, first of all, in terms of access. What I mean by that is, well, do you have access to things like job opportunities or education? Then I'd say, right, we start to get this idea of knock-on effects. So the knock-on effects of that might be, well, poor health, higher unemployment. And then I would say, right, last but not least, people are stuck in this cycle. So because they're now starting to experience one bad thing after another, well, it creates this knock-on impact. Okay? So, well, consequently then, this can lead us to get experiencing something like social segregation. Okay, so for example, things like gated communities leads to that, doesn't it? Interrupts this idea of community feel. Secondly, we might say, well, in rural areas or in prosper commuter villages, they might only be a few miles from sort of less attractive settlements. So you might start to see population decline. Let's put that one down. We might see lack of investment. I was going to put cash for a second because it's quicker. We might also say, right, because of this then, we might see a lot of investment. Okay, and that investment might come from overseas in very sort of wealthy property. Okay, so I'm here going to put property investment overseas. Okay, of course there are more than these. I'm just going for a few quick points. It's only a little revision or recap. Right then, let's talk new urban landscapes. Okay, so because of all of this then, what we're now starting to do is see a spring up of all of these different types of development. Okay, and I've listed all of the different types of development for you on the screen. So let's start then with the one at the top. So let's start with town centre mixed developments. Okay, so if you have a town centre mixed development, this involves mixing retail with things like leisure facilities, public gardens, new office and conference facilities. This could be the construction of things like upmarket residential areas, so it often involves things like gentrification of old buildings. So things like use of brownfield sites would fit in quite nicely here. Next up then, we want to talk a little bit about our heritage quarters. So often these form part of redevelopment schemes, so you might just improve this alongside something else. So what we try and do here is sort of preserve this distinctive cultural identity or product. Okay, so things like Chinatown or media industries or an area that's got a particular connection with the arts would fit into things like a cultural or heritage quarter. Okay, if it's got a strong historical connection with an identity, so again things like Dockland or jewellery, then that would sort of fall really well in sort of promoting its heritage or culture, and therefore it would become a heritage or cultural quarter. Fortress developments then up next. These ones are nice and simple. So it's just really saying, right, one recent trend we've seen in urban design is this idea of defensible space. Okay, so things like having a gated community, bus shelters, security systems, perimeter fencing, CCTV, all of that fits in as part of this idea of fortress development. Gentrification, we've already talked about lots, but sort of giving old houses a new sort of lease of life. Prosperity of residents becoming greater because we're attracting these new shops and services back in. Creating employment within an area. If you need to rewind the video a little bit, but we've already talked about that once, so I'm not going to spend too much longer on that. Edge cities. So these are starting to develop near suburban freeway junctions and airports. So the area must have things like substantial office space. Okay, it might be things like, right, a single end destination, previously undeveloped in sort of 1960s. These are the areas now then that we're starting to class as edge cities. And last but not least then, are postmodern Western cities. Okay, so buildings in postmodern Western cities normally have really varied design. They're often centerpieces or designed around the community that live there and sort of give power or control back to the locals rather than being sort of imposed on by the government. Okay, so those are your sort of 6 new urban landscapes that we're seeing at the moment. Again, these aren't just solitaries, they're not just one-offs. You might get a town centre mixed development alongside a heritage quarter, for example. Okay, quite often they go hand in hand with each other. Right then, let's talk about urban climate. Okay, so what we mean by urban climate is the set of climatic conditions that prevail in a large metropolitan area, and they often differ then from the climate of rural surroundings. Okay, so cities often create this idea of a climatic dome within which the weather is different from surrounding rural areas or temperature. Okay, so things like humidity, precipitation, visibility and wind speed might differ then in that inner city area compared to the rural surroundings. So really you can talk about urban climate, I think, under sort of 3 headings, and those are the ones that I've put here on the screen. So I might say, right, the first thing we'll talk about then is temperature, then we'll look at precipitation, and then last but not least we'll think about wind. So if we start then by thinking about temperature, well, the big thing we're going to start to see is this urban heat island effect, or UHI. Okay, and that's because then of things like lots of heat sources that are giving off that warmth, so machines, heating systems and people. We're getting lots of reflections of things like insulation. Okay, so I'll put this one down as well for you as a little reminder. Well, this heat then is going to be released slowly when the air cools at night. If we've got efficient drainage then, the urban surface removes surface water quickly, so there's less capacity for evaporation to take place. We've got typically less vegetation, which cools the air by transpiration. Okay, so all of those things then are contributing to that warming impact. Next then, if we think about precipitation and thunderstorms, well, urban areas, and let's jot this fact down, have up to 10% more rainfall than surrounding areas. So the rain typically lasts for longer and is a little bit more intense. So this increase in rainfall is because of our urban heat island, causing relatively low atmospheric pressure, the presence of high-rise buildings, and lots of particulate pollution, okay, which means there's an increased number then of nuclei present in the air. So as a result, we might see things like humidity and fog. Okay, we might say, well, relative humidity typically is lower in cities and surrounding rural areas, so we've got fewer bodies of water, lower rates of evapotranspiration to cause that. We might say, well, there's a greater concentration of airborne particulates, so things like condensation nuclei. Well, this combination means then there's going to be a much higher incidence of fog in our urban areas. So last but not least then, if we think about wind, we might say, well, the surface area of our cities is uneven due to all the varying heights of the buildings. So the buildings tend to exert powerful frictional drag on the air that moves over and around them, which creates us lots of turbulence. So therefore, the average wind speeds are lower in cities than surrounding rural areas. Okay, so we can just sum that up and say lower in cities. So if we think about then how that's going to impact us with our air quality, well, we'd say air quality is a direct reflection of atmospheric pollution in our urban areas. Okay, so again, we might say, well, how is this going to impact on these things? And again, we can sort of imply it a little bit, can't we? So we can say, well, the amount of air pollution depends on the rate in which pollutants are produced. So the key pollutions then that are likely to have an impact are things like our nitrogen dioxide, our sulfur dioxide and our particulate matter. So a significant local source of this would be things like traffic emissions. So what policies can we do to sort of impact on each of these three here? Well, we've got the Clean Air Act. So that's going to help, isn't it? Improve the quality here. So smoke-free zones and regulations on the amount of airborne pollution, particularly the amount of particulates in the air. Well, that's going to help us a lot with temperature. It's going to help regulate our precipitation. Vehicle control, so having traffic-free zones or pedestrianised areas. Public transport and encouraging people to use that massively helps. Zoning of industry, so controlling who builds what where. Again, helps to regulate wind. And vehicle emissions and legislations then. So think about things like the Beijing and number plates, okay, and the fact that only certain people can drive in the city on certain days. All of these schemes, and the more of them we use together in theory, the better we are able to manage our air quality. Urban drainage then, we're nearly at the end. So why is urban drainage really important? Well, we know urban areas affect the hydrology. Okay, so things like having an impermeable roof, a dense network of drains, we say, right, all of that stuff there really interferes with things like the lag time and discharge. Okay, therefore, if we were drawing a hydrograph for an urban area, we'd expect to see this sort of steeper rising and recessional limbs. Okay, we'd have a higher peak discharge. So why do we need to manage this? We'd say, right, this is because we're seeing so much intense rainfall that we actually need to sort of think, right, how can we manage this so we don't get loads of flooding and loads of surface runoff? Okay, so sometimes the measures that we've got in place are really inadequate. Okay, so the whole point of SUDS here, our sustainable urban drainage systems, is to say, right, if we construct these facilities and materials, then what we can start to do is store and drain the water naturally. Okay, so the picture here helps us out a little bit, doesn't it? Okay, we can put in things like our permeable surfaces. So if we have permeable surfaces, it allows the water to soak in. We might go for things like trenches to help funnel the water a little bit. Wetlands here, like we can see in the picture, another good one. We might say things like green roofs. Again, all to help with absorption of water. And again, we might say if we have river restoration schemes as well, well, again, that's going to help us to manage that whole idea of the urban catchment, the area surrounding it. Okay, your big example of this one here would be Enfield. I'd encourage you to go back and look at those case study notes. Right then, on to waste management. So we've got lots of different methods then of disposing of our waste in an urban area. And those are the ones then that you can see here on the screen. So very quickly we'll run through them. So the first method we have is unregulated. Okay, if waste is unregulated, then it's placed in a legal location. So anywhere it's disposed of, could be on the side of the road, could be sort of pumped into rivers or into other water sources. Recycling, so it's just the reprocessing of our waste, so things like plastics and paper. Recovery then is reusing our organic materials, so then we can consume that as energy. Incineration, so again, burning our waste. Burial, well, that's landfill, we're all familiar with that one. Submergence, so is the burial of waste at sea. And then trade is probably the one people are less familiar with. So electronic waste, and we sort of ship that around the world. So the last big thing to talk about then is this concept of sustainability, and something I think that's really important at the moment. So the most important thing to say is we have 4 dimensions of sustainability, and those are the 4 that you can see there on the screen. So if we're talking first of all about economic sustainability, We're saying, well, individuals and communities should have access to reliable income over time. Okay, so we're looking here mostly for two main things. We're looking for income, we're looking for employment. If we move towards social, we're saying, well, all individuals should have a reasonable quality of life with access to things like education, let's put that one on, food would be another thing, clean water. Third dimension of sustainability then is we're saying environmental, so there should be no lasting damage to the environment. Particularly here we're looking at renewable energy sources to lower that footprint. And then last but not least, we're looking for governance. So we're looking for sustainable policies, we're looking for planning, we're trying to reduce inequality. Therefore, if we're doing all four of these four things, we're meeting the 4 dimensions of sustainability. So what does that look like then in our city? We're thinking, right, what features could we possibly see? So after things like affordable housing, for example, that would be therefore socially sustainable. Next, we might say we're after energy efficiency. If something is energy efficient, therefore it's going to lower our footprint again, isn't it? So it'd be environmentally sustainable. We might look for things like public transport. There's another one we can add on. Next then, we might look for things like cultural amenities. We might say, well, wherever possible, we're going to see areas of open space. Next then, we want our green land. It would probably have really strong waste management. Okay, so if we continue to do all of those things and identify those things, then chances are we're looking or moving towards being sustainable. Okay, so again, if we do things like have a reduced consumption of water, if we place emphasis on recycling, if we start to reduce fuel emissions, then we're moving towards this sustainable city. So go and check your examples or your 2 case studies for this one. But Curitiba is a really good place to start here. So I suppose the final thing then really that's left to say is that's everything to do with contemporary urban environment in a very brief whistle-stop tour. Of course, you've got the revision guides to go back and support you. So if you need to rewind to a section of this video or go and look something that I've set up in this video in a book, now would be the opportunity to do that. I would encourage you to go back now and look through your notes and your booklets and think, what are your case studies here, and get those really clear in your head. Okay. Obviously, of course, you've got the case study revision cards and you've got the contemporary urban environments revision tools. But if you have any questions, please do say. Very best of luck with your revision.